Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Day Zero podcast. I'm Spectre with me is Z. A quick mention before we get into topics is that in 2 weeks we are going to be going on a Christmas break, so that's after the next episode, the week of the 23rd and the 30th. We will be off, and then we'll be back the week of the 6th. So, yeah, with that said, we can get into some of our topics, and one of them is a favorite that we like to go into, especially around this time of year, and that's Humble Bundle. So they have put out another hacking bundle by No Starch Press, which we like to talk about when they go out there. And Z in particular likes to talk about these, so I'll let him get into it.
Yeah, at least the No Starch Press, I do kind of skip the Pact, and the Wiley bundles have been a bit hit or miss. So we haven't talked about that, but I think there was a Wiley bundle back maybe in October or so. So we don't always cover them, but with the No Starch bundles, generally speaking, like anything out from No Starch Press is good. Obviously, things that were published a long time ago, do get dated, and there's that aspect. But beyond that, yeah, this is also kind of a yearly thing. In the last quarter of every year for quite a few years now, there has been a No Starch Press bundle. And this year's no different. A number of these books are kind of repeats from past bundles. Main ones that are new, kind of for this bundle, are kind of the top two rows. That's this Hacks, Leaks, and Revelations, which I haven't read. Looks kind of cool because it's coming from someone who's an investigative journalist, kind of coming from their perspective and more like OSN and like analyzing leaked information. Kind of seems neat. Not really my wheelhouse, but yeah, seems like a interesting perspective on that. Windows Security Internals with PowerShell, or at least the old name was Windows Security Internals with PowerShell. I think it did publish without that extra tagline, but that kind of gives you a bit of context onto where the book's going to go. Is a new book from James Forshaw, well-known name. Was that Project Zero? We've talked about quite a few pieces of his research in the past. Well known, knows a lot about Windows security. So yeah, as a book, you're getting a lot of kind of that security architecture information on Windows. So I'm sure it's a good book, but it's not my area to really judge. And that's kind of true of the next few here, where I actually, instead of going through every book as I've kind of started doing here, I will say as a bundle, it seems like it's a pretty solid bundle, especially at like buying the entire bundle. If what you're interested in is more the malware development, like red teaming on more like the implant side of things, because you do have books here like the Windows Security Internals, Evading EDR, Evasive Malware, the Android Malware Handbook, and the Art of Mac Malware Volume 1. I don't think a volume 2 has been published yet. So you've got kind of several of these more malware, maldev oriented books. You've also got malware data science. That's a bit older. That's like 2017 or 2018, I think. But the other ones there are part of like the full bundle, and for the most part look pretty interesting. The Android malware handbook, I'm maybe a little bit more meh on, but evading EDR and evasive malware do seem interesting. And of course, Windows Security Internals. So it seems like a decent bundle if you're interested in that area. You've also got a few other like noteworthy books here. Attacking Network Protocols, another Forshaw book uh, that I've recommended a number of times. It is focused, like it is a little bit older in the sense of being 2017, I think. But it's about attacking network. Like there hasn't been a lot of change on that front when it comes to like reverse engineering a network protocol or something. It's not some like very dynamic field.
If there's
Uh
anything that's timeless, it's networking protocols.
yeah, like it's not, I'm not too worried about the dating on that one. Like there could be a few things that have changed with like tooling on analysis, but you're fine with that book. The Ghidra book, it's Chris Eagle's book, and fairly well known. It's basically equivalent like the IDA book for IDA, but Ghidra more up to date because the IDA book was written how long ago? Ghidra book, Ghidra just came out, so it's just came out back like 2019, so it can't be that old. I think the book's from 2020 though. Linux Basics for Hackers is a book that I haven't actually read. I see it recommended quite a bit, And so I kind of gave it a review, and it's kind of what's it's like it's Linux basics, so you may or may not have a need for it, but it is there. Practical IoT Hacking was a book that kind of surprised me in terms of just the quality, I guess, of its coverage for like the basics of IoT stuff, of like that level of like doing pen tests on that. So yeah, some noteworthy books in there. I actually did a review all the way back on I actually took note of when this was episode 22 of the podcast about
That
this
was a bit
real
ago.
world bug hunting. Yeah, it was quite a while ago. Though it is kind of worth calling out here because real world bug hunting and Tangled Web, these two books, are part of the cheapest bundle. So that's just like I imagine that's about $1 US, $1.39 Canadian. It's the price it's showing on here, but basically like $1 easily worth it for I think the real world bug hunting book. If you're onto the bug bounty stuff, you'll learn I think a lot of the actual attacks better through like Portswigger. What I do appreciate with the book though is it basically just is going through a bunch of bug bounty reports. And so you're getting these attacks, but you're getting a lot more of the real world and not just the isolated constrained environment of Portswigger. You're kind of seeing like, here is how those bugs have appeared in real applications as of the time of writing. So things have changed a bit there. Tangled Web used to be a pretty often recommended book. It's kind of about how the web works, but it's like from 2011 or maybe 2014. It's kind of from the early 2010s. So like web technology has changed. Even things like same site would be entirely missing here. So foundationally, it's still good. Like it's not a bad book. There's more to kind of do and learn though beyond it. Either way, for the bundle, that cheap $1 bundle, I think easily worth it for the real world bug hunting book. The full bundle, I kind of say if you're interested on the malware side of things, easily some very solid books in here. And I think there's still good, if you're not as interested on the malware stuff, there are still some good books from kind of a variety of topics, like so the attacking network protocols, practical IoT hacking, the Ghidra book, on like the cheaper 12 item bundle there. They do also have Black Hat Go. I'm a bit ambivalent about the Black Hat series. If you want kind of projects that are somewhat security and hacking related to learn a language, any of the Black Hat series is kind of good because there's like Black Hat Go, Black Hat Python, I think is the well-known one. I think there's Black Hat Bash. There's also Black Hat GraphQL, which I've been meaning to give a better read of, but that's a little bit different than I think the domain that the more general purpose programming language ones work in. So yeah, that's kind of a bunch of books here. As much as I don't go out of my way to recommend old books, books are still a good resource, even if information is like technically all available on the internet. Somebody's gone through the hassle of pulling everything together, all this information, deciding what's worthwhile, what is worth putting together, putting it in print, and there is value in that. So I do still kind of recommend books here and there. I'm just a lot more picky about what I personally recommend these days. But yeah,
Yeah.
it looks like good bundle, and I think donations. So as with Humble bundles, they always kind of have the split there. It looks like they're going towards EFF and the ACLU. So two solid organizations doing good work on the legal front.
All right, so getting into some of our topics, Microsoft has announced their Adaptive Prompt Injection Challenge, LLMail-Inject. So as that last part kind of hints at, the challenge here centers around a mail service. For example, using LLM to like summarize emails or something like that. And the premise of the challenge is prompt injection. So, kind of the classic thing. We don't talk about it too much on the podcast because typically it technically speaking, it's not super interesting. It's mainly just, prompting to see if you can give the LLM instructions to do something that it's not supposed to do, like disclose secrets or something. That said, even though it may not be like the most exciting thing, it is very important, especially as LLMs become more prevalent in a lot of industries. So, of course, Microsoft has a vested interest in securing of LLMs, so that's why they're launching this challenge. They do have rewards as well. So I just want to get the exact number, but I believe in the challenge there's going to be like 40 levels that you have to escalate through. So, each level is going to have like sequentially higher and higher defense levels and whatnot. But if you're a top team, they have a prize pool of $10,000. So not a huge prize pool by any means, but it is something where if you're interested in getting into LLMs or just, hacking on LLM prompt injection, could be something to consider. So they have 4,000 for the top team, 3,000 for second, 2,000 for third, and 1,000 for fourth. And they also say the winning teams will be invited to co-present at the IEEE conference on secure and trustworthy machine learning. It's a little bit unclear if they mean all of the top 4 teams, or if they just mean because they have teams in plural here. So I'm not quite sure what that all entails, but that seems like kind of a cool reward too.
I was just going to say that whole reward feels a little bit weird. Like, you
It is
win
a
the
little weird,
CTF
yeah.
and you get to co-present at like an IEEE conference. Like, oh no, unless co-presenting also means you're getting your name on like paper or something, then maybe that has a bit more value. But yeah, it sounds interesting. I've not checked this out, but given the fact they've kind of designed their challenges here using some real world kind of defenses here, some actual research going on there, um and they've set this up in a way that I believe is supposed to get increasingly more difficult. Now I don't see that written here. Now I see the
I
40
think it's implied.
levels. Yeah, I thought I read that. Maybe it was just something implied. I mean, it would be hard to be exacting in that, like each one is exactly more difficult. But yeah, I mean, we haven't called out any of these LLM CTFs, but I think the fact that it's coming out from Microsoft Research Center or Security Research Center is noteworthy. There is some reward. I don't think the reward's going to be a massive motivation. Uh, but it does mean like this is likely going to be pretty decent quality and may also be good just for learning, because I think there is some structure to this. I just want to see if I can find. Okay, I don't see anything actually mentioning difficulty, so maybe it's not, but or maybe it's not quite what I thought, but it is a chance to play around with quite a few different setups there, which does make it, I think, somewhat interesting to me, just to be able to play around with some of those setups too.
Sorry, they do kind of have it. It's just it's a little bit hard to find. It doesn't jump out immediately. But they say the website also provides comprehensive information on how to get started, including how to configure your environment and submit entries, and it ensures that participants can easily join and contribute regardless of their level of experience. So that kind of speaks to what you were talking about there.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I mean, we haven't covered a lot of those CTFs, but I think this is noteworthy coming from Microsoft, having the rewards in there. So yeah, I mean, if you're interested on the LLM stuff, there's kind of a playground to play around with. I'll just open or get the link here to the actual competition website here open too.
Where I mentioned the fact that there was the 40 levels, I should mention as well that it does run for over a month. So it starts on December 9th and it runs through to January 20th. So it's not like it's a 2-day weekend CTF where you're supposed to go through 40 levels. There is quite a nice time window here. So yeah, seems like kind of a cool thing though. And again, like, the LLM prompt injection stuff isn't really my thing, but there are people out there who really enjoy like prompt engineering and the security aspect of that. So something to check out.
Yeah, it is a fun area. Like, I have had fun when I've played around with some of that, although that was still kind of in what I'd say the early days with LLMs kind of. I mean, it's only been a couple years, so it's not like it's that old. But it is kind of fun to play around with, and to know about, like to at least have that understanding for when you do encounter it.
Yeah. And kind of continuing on the machine learning trend, we have another post here that is breaking down adversarial machine learning attacks through red team challenges. It is sort of like adversarial attacks on image recognition and classifiers. This is something we used to talk about quite a bit in the podcast early days. Some of you who have been with us for a while may remember we used to cover white papers on this topic quite a bit, and we eventually stopped because it was just it was a lot of like similar research that just came out over and over because fooling classifiers seems like it's not something that's super hard to do. That said, this post goes into a fair amount of background on that. And I know Z wanted to talk about it a little bit, so I'll let him talk and then yeah.
Yeah, and it covers 3 different CTF challenges. 2 of them involve prompt injection. One is like an OCR, where it's like you OCR and you get a prompt injection. The other one is like an XML. It does a case sensitive check to prevent you from injecting into the XML, and then you can kind of do your own prompting. I don't even care about those 2, so I'm really just not going to focus on them. And usually we don't really cover these sort of CTF write-ups. Maybe it's because this isn't an area like I have a lot of blog posts about people writing on, but I haven't seen a post that really gets into what they cover with the adversarial images and attacking the classifier, which is the first challenge that they talk about in this post. And I think where a very significant chunk of this post is spent on. I'm just scrolling through here and I'm like 2/3 of the way through the document. And it's just about that one. And then they kind of have the other 2 at the end. The one thing I liked here is while there's nothing novel necessarily in what they're talking about here, it did feel very approachable in terms of understanding how these sort of adversarial attacks worked against classifier. The CTF challenge here was based around the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Just get the wolf classified as a Granny Smith apple, but don't be too obvious. And so, it follows their process of going through taking a base image of a timber wolf along with the CTF challenge where they could submit the image and actually get information back about how it was classified. So yeah, the post itself is basically going through, or this first 2/3 of the post is going through attacking a classifier and trying to evade the classifier. So specifically, they're taking an image of the wolf, and they're trying to take that image and make small modifications to it such that it is misclassified. And so, as they make these changes, they could make just very slight changes and see how it gets classified, and then say, okay, well, changing this pixel here did something, and changing this pixel here made it more recognizable or whatever. And the fundamental idea of these attacks is just like the training data and how these models tend to work is they work on like statistics. They work on what they've seen. The training data they've seen is like this pixel over here being this color tells me this thing or whatever. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it does mean that making these what would normally be imperceptible or very minimally perceptible changes to an image to a human can make a massive difference to the AI. And similarly, things that would make no difference to a human can also end up making a so I guess as the example that they have here is just rotating an image. Like, they have a picture of a cat here and they're 96% sure it's a cat. You rotate it at 71%. Like, it lost confidence, but a human would still like see no difference between these 2. Whereas the computer needs to be trained to kind of see that and figure that out. So in that training, like, there's a lot of just like black magic that goes on, and they start walking through some of the math as they look through, trying to find the boundaries here for what is or is not a cat in this example case, or with the wolf, and working through getting the wolf image to be misclassified. And so on a whole, like, the post does get into a lot of the math here, figuring this out, the type of changes, all of that, leading to them actually coming up with an image that still very much looks like the wolf, but is classified as the Granny Smith apple instead.
Yeah, I will kind of say I think this is a post that you will be able to appreciate more if you're into like the math level of machine learning and you're that deep into it. If you're not and you're just kind of at it more from a security perspective and aren't familiar with as much of the math, it might be a bit harder to follow this post. Just saying that because that's kind of the bucket that I'm in. When you see like the math that it goes into, I don't fully understand all of that. It's sort of out of my purview. But if you are into that, you will probably appreciate a lot of the detail that it goes into.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Like, it does go more onto the math. But this is very much like the types of attacks against classifiers are very much like math-based attacks.
That comes with the territory, yeah.
Yeah, so I thought as opposed like yes, it does go into a lot of math. I thought it was still relatively accessible coming in, but perhaps that is just I have a pretty strong math background, so maybe I'm just mistaken on that. But in terms of posts, like I haven't seen a lot that's written about. It's not that nobody's writing about it, it's just not really on my normal feed here. So seeing this sort
A
of
lot of it is in dry white papers that are
yeah,
difficult to get
exactly.
through. Yeah.
Exactly that. A lot of times I've seen is more on that front and more on the math and math paper front rather than security oriented. So seeing it here, I wanted to give this a shout out and at least call out this post because I did find it interesting, at least for this first bit. The fact that the OCR input was used and you could inject into there, like I don't really care. Like that's just kind of a classic CTF sort of feel to the challenge. But this adversarial thing, like this is kind of a whole class of attack against classifiers, which is interesting to know about and understand. Unlike the LMs, the classifiers are still definitely used. And it's not like they've been replaced. Like they fill a very different gap than the LLMs fill. So still kind of worth being aware of and knowing, although you don't necessarily run into this a lot with just standard like application security. It's kind of on the boundaries.
I was gonna say actually, have you really seen a lot of use of classifiers in a security critical context? Because when I'm thinking of where I've seen classifiers in real world, a lot of the time it's in like say the Apple Photos app where you search for like cat or something and it'll try to find photos with cats in it. Like that's where I've mostly seen classifiers where you're in that self-attack territory where it's not really useful to like attack yourself and try to misclassify things. That's just kind of an inconvenience. That
so
said, it could just be like a bias thing where I'm just not exposed to areas where it is used in more of a security critical context.
no, I think you're right. A lot of use cases aren't that security critical. Like, but even with the visual classifier aspect here of vehicles, is it security critical?
Right, like the
Um,
self-driving stuff. Yeah, that's where
yeah,
we've seen it
the
before kind of being
the like
explored.
human detection stuff, like there's kind of those sides where they're not exactly security critical, but they are still kind of important areas in terms of being somewhat security critical. I would say enterprise antivirus stuff, things that are like taking a look at the traffic inspection, some of
Like
that can also
EDRs,
do it.
that's fair.
Yeah, I have not been able to play around a lot with that myself. That's not something I've been able to play around, but that is an area where I could see an application of it. But yeah, it is a fair point. Like it is one of those things that you don't run into a lot, especially in your standard application security environment. But it is kind of there on the peripheries where like things are using it. It's just not always obvious when it's being used, like things like the more security tooling performing some of this. Like you're not necessarily going to be aware of the classification. You're not going to have all the same knowledge about how things are getting classified. It's a whole different sort of setup, or it's things like Apple Photos or Google Photos or something do the classification where like you don't care that much about the attack.
Yeah.
But
Uh
nonetheless, I found it interesting. It is an area of security research.
oh, 100%. Yeah, there's definitely value in doing the research on that. And like I said, the only like critical context I remember seeing was for like self-driving cars, and you know the context was a little bit of a high ask. Like a lot of the time you needed access to like the CAN bus or something. That said, I feel like that specific concern has kind of faded in recent years because it seems like a lot of the like fully autonomous self-driving stuff has kind of uh been rejected by a lot of like regulation and stuff like that. It's kind of like we know we're not really going in that direction anymore. So like a human in the loop has kind of been a requirement, right? So
But
like
there's
those
still
sorts of
things
like
that
even
could be
who's
done. Um,
there is, but the impact is mitigated quite a bit from where we thought it might be, say like 5 years ago or something.
it's definitely different. I mean, I still think there's room for. I feel like we covered a paper where it was like a adversarial stop sign, where it was just
Yeah,
like something on the side of the road that would be interpreted as like the stop sign or something. And
Yep.
something like that, like, sure, it's not going to cause any sort of massive incident, like, oh no, the vehicle stopped, especially if you get the human in the loop who can like take over or something. Which I don't know how Waze works on that front, because Waze is the one that I think is still pushing like the fully autonomous stuff in like the San Francisco area or whatever. I think they have some mechanism where humans can like take control remotely. I'm not sure about that, but you could imagine the situation where if a bunch of things think that there is like a stop sign and like kind of using that as like a distributed sort of attack and like a distributed denial of service in a sense, just by using like a stick or something. Like there's that sort of realm of attack and misclassification that's in theory possible. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely different than what it was, or the type of things you'd be considering where it's like everybody's got a self-driving car.
Yeah. All right. So shifting away from machine learning, we have a post by Gray Noise Labs on null problem or the dangers of an invisible byte. Now, the premise for this post is a bit of an older vulnerability. It talks about an off bypass in ASUS routers. It was like a 2021 CVE, and it was due to the mishandling of null bytes in a token field that was received over an HTTP header. Sort of your classic issue where it's doing a string compare, passing a null byte as the first character, the string compare just terminates early and it passes the authentication check.
So I meant to look, but did we cover this bug? Because I this
We
feels
might have.
super
We've
familiar.
definitely we've definitely covered a bug that is very similar to this. Maybe not this exact one, but we've definitely covered one that was very similar at
We
least.
we did cover it actually, episode 76. I just managed
We
to
did.
pull it
Okay.
up here.
Yeah, not
Um
surprising.
yeah, I it felt really familiar. I meant to look it up before the show if we had covered this or not. Anyway,
Yeah.
go on.
But yeah, like the issue there is a bit older. It's not like super interesting. But what I thought was cool and what this post mainly delves into is the fallibility of testing when you have null byte issues. Because they talk about the fact that, like, hey, null bytes are kind of this weird case where because it's typically used as a null terminator and it's not an ASCII character, so you can't just like easily type it. It can be difficult to actually pass a null byte to even like test for these issues. And they had done some like testing and tried to see like scanners hitting this issue, and in their case every single scanner that tried to test for this issue tested incorrectly because it wasn't actually passing a null byte. It was passing an escape sequence for a null byte that wasn't actually getting parsed. So it was just like the literal \0. It wasn't actually passing a null byte. So just something that like isn't really talked about a lot or is easy to not think about is the fact that some like this class of issue is hard to even test for if you're looking for it because of the fact that like different things are going to parse it, like may or may not parse escape sequences, or they may parse them differently, or maybe they don't accept escape sequences, so you have to write like a tool or a script that will send raw binary data. And it's like it's just a kind of a problem that you can have in tooling that I haven't really seen talked about. So,
Yeah, it. I thought it was interesting here. Kind of have different takeaways here. I kind of put some blame here towards the person who wrote like the original nuclei template. So what they call out here was basically the Actrodis post, which I might as well pull up here. Uh, just as the original advisory for this bug. They talk about this and they just use like the \0 as like the cookie. And since they want to show like there is a null byte here, but it's not a printable character, \0, pretty classic way. And I guess whoever wrote the nuclei template for this for testing for this bug copied and pasted that. And so they ended up with the literal string, and then they ended up with people repeating that literal string, including some who would also escape the backslash in there, getting the literal //0 instead of the single \0. So kind of interesting how that one happened. But yeah, it's also just like it gets mentioned here that the person who wrote the nuclei template didn't validate that this worked. They indicate, and they did the pull request on that this was not validated locally. So they wrote the template. They basically just copied and pasted from Actrodis. Here's their test case, copy and paste it in, and away you go. ending up with everybody who depends on just the nuclei templates as kind of being their source and scanning based off that, not getting the correct thing.
Who unit tests the unit tests?
I mean, every exploit that, like, on a pen test, if you're running an exploit somebody else wrote, you should be looking at and checking what it does. But I'll be honest, when I've like audited what something's doing, I'm usually trying to audit to make sure it's not doing something stupid. So I'll look like, oh, it's making a network request. Okay, this looks like it's going there. Like, okay, this seems legitimate. And I'm not necessarily auditing, uh, so the _0 actually is some that might stand out to me a little bit, where I'd go and look like, oh, are you supposed to send it escaped or not escaped? Like that is something that will always kind of hit in my mind because I've been bit by that sort of issue before. But it is also something that's kind of, the whole validating an exploit is somewhat lazily done at times, especially if you just want to test this quick thing, you're not super worried about it, you're not looking. I find it fascinating that not only did they have like thousands of requests hitting their honeypot here, like 230,000 or almost 231,000 hits.
The final number I see is 379,000, but yeah. That's when they get
okay,
into
actually,
like,
yeah, at the end here they have that number. So they had another number up on just their honeypots and they have in the last week numbers. Yeah, just about 380,000 hits with a poorly done exploit and 0 hits that actually hit their honeypot doing the proper attack. The fact that there's 0 genuinely is surprising to me. Like, I totally get it where a lot of automated systems are probably just taking like, oh, somebody wrote a nuclei template, we're just going to toss that out on everything, but nothing is actually written correctly. Like, I guess I believe it because it's just a random bug out there that, like, who's actually kind of written an exploit for versus using something out there. It's still just surprising to me how not one single thing actually hit it correctly. That said, I imagine any security researcher who's like, oh, I'm actually in this environment needing to exploit this old router and this old version of the router is going to be able to look and very quickly be like, okay, here's what I need to do. Like, if I ran into that CV, I probably wouldn't even be looking for a script to exploit it because it's this sort of simple thing that I just know how to write already. And so I could imagine that it's not necessarily being used apart from just like a wide scan with like the nuclei stuff. I just found this to be really fascinating nonetheless, because it is an interesting case of, kind of a lazy template being written there. Like, I'm definitely not a fan of the fact that somebody actually, put that out there. It's like, yeah, I didn't even bother testing what I'm putting up here, but yeah, take it. And
yeah, and that's kind of what their conclusion is like, maybe test your exploits before contributing them to an open source tool, eh? Like, yeah, it's totally a fair expectation. Because it can be easy to like, and maybe not in this case, but it can be easy to gaslight yourself or other people into thinking that something is secure when it's not due to poorly written tests. So it is something that's kind of important to get right. But yeah, the other like sentence that I kind of wanted to highlight is in the intent section, where they say it kind of puts us in a weird situation because the people sending the broken payloads still probably have malicious intent, but we don't really want to tag payloads that don't actually exploit things. And again, that's kind of an area that's not really talked about too much, but like when you're trying to profile attackers and stuff, like a lot of these like garbage tests that aren't actually doing anything, like what do you do with them? Do you throw them out because they're not doing anything? Do you keep them because there is intent there? Like, again, sort of an interesting question and one that like doesn't have a clear answer, but yeah, I just thought this was like a fun post with what it delves into, just because of the fact that it's kind of a weird area and it's a case that doesn't have a clear cut answer of how to handle it.
Yeah, I mean, it's also like what they're doing is they're looking at honeypots and what they're doing, and what they're actually requesting. So, like, you're not necessarily going to drop it because it's not working, because you're still kind of interested. It's kind of the question, though, like, do you do a separate take for the real exploit versus the fake one? I kind of stand on the side of like, once something has started to be like, even if it's being misclassified, unless you catch that really quickly, you want to keep classifications the same and like permanently classify. That's kind of my thinking there, just for kind of long-term reliability. And the classic XKCD about making changes will always break somebody's workflow. Somebody
Yeah.
out there is depending on it getting that tag, and when you change that, it's going to break. I don't know. But they've already put the information out there that like it is broken. So I also feel like when it comes to their tags, I'm not sure really what the concern is there. But I'm also kind of unfamiliar with their product. So that is probably just more my lack of exposure there. I thought the whole thing was kind of interesting nonetheless. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to their tags here, I've like never really used their visualization system to actually see like, oh, how many things are getting tagged this way, and do we make a real versus a fake tag for it? I think, yeah, I personally like it's already being classified that way, and like that is their intent. Even if they're doing it wrongly, their intent is to attempt to bypass or attempt this auth bypass. So yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't really classify it as like a false positive, so to
Yeah,
speak.
it's still kind of garbage because it's not a threat because it's doing it wrong. But yeah, that is kind of their own product thing. That's way outside any decision I ever need to make.
Yeah. But again, like I thought it was just kind of interesting that they mention it and get you thinking a little bit. So
It's
yeah,
quick and
really
silly
cool post.
posts as they describe it. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. All right. So getting into a little bit more of a technical post, we have a post by PT Swarm on new dog, old tricks, DaMageCard attacks, attack targets memory directly through SD card reader. And they have DaMageCard for those who are listening. They have it, kind of capitalized with DMA being capitalized, which kind of hints at what this is all about. So yeah, the premise for this is kind of talking about SD Express, which is a newer PCIe based protocol for SD devices, because you're with like 4K and stuff kind of on the rise and even getting into 8K now. You are getting into the situation where you're having lots and lots of data on these SD cards, and the SD transfer speeds of like classic SD cards sucks. If you ever have to pull like large video files or something, it's going to take forever. So to kind of fill that gap, this newer PCIe based protocols come along. And yeah, when you get into PCIe, DMA attacks immediately come to mind for security reasons. So this post has like a pretty good history on like DMA attacks and the attempts to secure against them.
Yeah, and
Because
I'm
yeah.
just going to ask, because I feel like some of our listeners probably are unfamiliar with DMA attacks. Could you quickly talk about that?
Yeah, so when you think of like
Sorry
typical
to put
memory
you on the
copy,
spot.
no, it's all good. I was planning to go into it a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
So
If you were going to get to it later, never
oh
mind.
yeah, it's no worries. But yeah, so the whole thing with DMA is like in a typical copy operation, you're going through the CPU. The CPU is running instructions to copy memory. And for most things, that's fine. But when you have like a bulk data transfer and you need it really fast, uh, in order to get like a massive speed increase, it's beneficial to just bypass the CPU entirely and have a device directly transfer data to memory. So that's what DMA is, direct memory access. So because you're cutting the CPU out of the loop, you're getting that speed benefit. But of course, pretty much all the security isolation mechanisms that you have are going to be on the CPU. So DMA, especially on systems that aren't like secured properly against it, it's easy to not think of a PCIe device as an attacker controlled device for some reason. Now, don't get me wrong, like you're not going to exploit a DMA attack remotely or something. It does require a specific context to exploit it, but PCIe should absolutely not be considered trusted. So as soon as you have like an untrusted device and a weak setup, you can just have like a device that you plug in that just directly overwrites like kernel memory or something. Like it's, that has happened in the past. They state that while DMA attacks are still relatively easy to pull off and not well defended against a lot of targets, they're not the path of least resistance. But they can be in some scenarios, because especially with something like bus mastering DMA, which they talk about a little bit, the CPU doesn't even have to be alerted to the fact that a DMA transaction is taking place. Because after all, the whole idea with DMA is keeping the CPU out of the loop. So the technology that ultimately got relied on mostly for securing against DMA attacks is the IOMMU, or the IO memory management unit. So I'm not going to go into like all the specifics of how that works, but the basis for an IOMMU is it's like a device that sits on the chip, and it has device tables set up that determine which areas of the address space any given device can access. So each device is going to have a device table entry, and it will specify like, okay, the GPU can access this area of memory that it's supposed to be able to access for accessing textures or whatever. But it's not supposed to access the kernel data because it would have no reason to want to write there. So the IOMMU can be used to secure against DMA attacks. The problem is properly setting up an IOMMU is really difficult, especially in spaces where you don't have a controlled and locked down ecosystem. Mainly, like I'm talking about Windows, for example. And you can also have different IOMMU configs running at different times. So, for example, with an attack they tried in this blog post on a laptop that had SD Express, the operating system's IOMMU was limiting their attack capability, but the UEFI IOMMU config at like the BIOS level was not limiting as much. So they were able to use that to attack like some main memory. There was also some devices like the Aya Neo Air Plus handheld console that didn't configure an IOMMU at all. So, a lot of this post is kind of talking about the history of DMA attacks, and there's not really something super novel here. It's just kind of yet another entry point to do DMA and how that can be exploited. But it's worth mentioning because, like I said, like even though DMA attacks have kind of been talked about for years, a lot of vendors and stuff still just don't really care to secure against it, or kind of treat it as like not worth the trade-off. Like they would rather have DMA for the speed and, security risk be damned sort of deal, especially because, it does require a local attacker context. But yeah, like with these SD cards and everything, it is yet another avenue to potentially do some malicious things, and anything that would use SD card express can potentially be vulnerable there. So yeah, just a really good post on the history of DMA attacks. So if it's something that's interesting to you that you're not like you don't fully understand, I think this post is a great introduction to DMA and how it can be used in attacks.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate with this is just the fact that it's going through a lot of information that's just here's how we got to where we are today. Here's how, instead of just here's how it works, it's a lot of the evolution of the technology up to what we're at today, which I found really interesting. Seeing the history, how things kind of came, what the thought process was that led us to where we are.
Yeah,
Although I
exactly.
will just really quickly call you early on during this post, you mentioned, you're not going to be exploiting the DMA remotely. There is the whole remote DMA over like InfiniBand and stuff over Ethernet. I'm not super familiar on that, but it does exist in like the cloud environments. I believe they tend to use that, so maybe you will.
Yeah, I guess I should say like it's not commonly going to be exploited remotely. I'm sure there are some setups where it could happen, but for the
Yeah,
most part,
that's
it's a local attack model.
yeah.
Yeah, and they kind of call it out in this post, but the big area where DMA has been huge lately, by lately I mean like the last couple of years, is in cheating. Because again, where DMA bypasses the CPU and everything, it gets around a lot of stuff that any cheats are trying to leverage to, enforce either the integrity or at least checking the integrity of data and whatever. So yeah, like with like a kernel driver anti cheat, you can get around a lot of the stuff that it would be doing by using a malicious device that does DMA to the game's memory. So that's where a lot of the like DMA stuff has been lately, and it has kind of been a problem that anti cheats have been trying to deal with. So again, kind of your overlap in security between the attackers that we typically like to think of, like malware developers or nation states or whatever, and also bleeding into the cheating and game development space. You kind of have that overlap. That overlap is very strong with DMA as well.
Yeah, I guess part of the thing with DMA is it's very evasive. Like the whole point
Yeah,
is that there isn't oversight. or there's
Yeah.
minimal oversight.
Yeah, you're trying to eliminate that overhead.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So yeah, with that said, that's all the posts we have for today. So unless you have any last minute thoughts, C, we'll wrap it up there.
Yeah, no shout outs.
All good. I'll once again reiterate that next week will be our last episode before our short winter break for the holidays. So yeah, we will see you next week.